Welcome, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Lee Lowry, and I'm the Executive Director of the American School Health Association. And we're pleased to present today's webinar, Gender Identity Issues Impact Us All. Next. Before we get started, I'd like to share a little bit about the American School Health Association. Otherwise known as ASHA, we are the only organization that addresses multiple disciplines in school health and that is devoted solely to school health. Our membership of approximately 800 individuals represents school health as administrators at the local, state, and national levels, as health and education professionals in a pre-K through 12 school setting, and as academics who conduct research that informs school health professionals. We're also the proud publishers of the Journal of School Health, a premier journal in the area of school and adolescent health. Next. Members of ASHA can elect to receive a hard copy or electronic copy of our journal. Our membership fee is inexpensive and provides you access to the journal and to our biweekly e-newsletter, School Health Action, as well as free continuing education hours through webinars and CE qualifying JOSH articles. If you haven't already, please consider joining, volunteering, and becoming a member of the ASHA community. Visit us at ashaweb.org to learn more. Next. If you missed our 2015 conference, today's webinar was pulled together from a 3-hour workshop session that our speakers presented last fall. This is just one great example of the numerous sessions that we offer. So consider joining us for our 2016 conference, which will be held between October 6th through the 8th in Baltimore, Maryland, and meet, share, and inspire ideas and conversations with like-minded school health professionals. And please note, if you are interested in submitting a session proposal for our conference, our call for papers will open in just a few weeks. Next. As I mentioned, the continuing education credit for today's webinar is free for all members. If you are a non-member and you would like to receive CE credit for this webinar, we require a payment of $30. After the webinar, you can receive one Category 1 CE/CH for MCHES and CHES, one contact hour for continuing nursing education, or a certificate of attendance based on 70% or more participation today. Participation is measured by the amount of time the webinar remains active on your screen. We'll provide details for obtaining CE in a post-webinar email that will go out this week. Next. Before you meet today's speakers, I'd like to share a little bit about a framework that unites ASHA's diverse membership. ASHA believes that schools have a responsibility to meet the needs of the whole child. The whole school, whole community, whole child model, developed jointly by the CDC and ASCD, provides a framework for the health and education sectors at the state and local levels to work towards stronger alignment, integration, and collaboration. This approach puts the student in the center. The goal is to ensure that all students are safe, healthy, engaged, supported, and challenged. This holistic and synergistic approach requires schools, students, families, and community partners to focus on improving both health and educational outcomes, and to create schools that nurture and support all students. It is a team effort, and collaboration is the key to success. A multidisciplinary approach that involves school nurses, counselors, health educators, physical educators, community experts, administrators, and students can better leverage resources and expertise to address the needs of the whole child, meeting the child's physical, emotional, social, and academic needs. Using the knowledge and wisdom of the school health team, schools can develop policies and programs that support all students, keep them safe from physical or emotional harm, and empower them to take responsibility for their own health and well-being. Recognizing that sexual health is a key component of wellness, the WSCC team develops policies and programs that respect individual differences and at the same time educate school personnel, families, community members, and most importantly, other students about issues such as gender identity. Next. A couple of notes before we begin. Your phones will remain muted for the 60-minute duration of this webinar. Unfortunately, because our speakers had to condense a 3-hour session from our conference into just 55 minutes, we will not be able to include a Q&A session today. However, if you have a question for our presenters, we will share their email addresses at the end of the presentation so that you can ask them your questions directly. We are recording today's session, and we will send you a link to the recording as well as to the evaluation survey within the next couple of days. Now, let's get started. We're delighted to have both Nora Gelperin and Dan Rice with us today presenting Gender Identity Issues Impact Us All. At this time, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Nora so that she can tell you a little bit about herself. Nora?
Greatly. Thank you so much, and thanks to the American School Health Association for providing this opportunity for Dan and myself to talk about this really important and critical and very much evolving topic. So as Lee said, my name is Nora Gelperin. I'm going to come back and tell you a little bit more about my organization in just a second, but I want to pause here and invite Dan to come on in.
Good afternoon, folks. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Dan Rice. I'm the Director of Training at ANSWER, and I'm thrilled that we could be all together for this next hour to do this webinar together.
Great. So let me just tell you a little bit about Advocates for Youth, which is where I come from. We're a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C., and we do lots of work both domestically here in the United States and around the world. But the piece I wanted to point out to everyone on the webinar today is our Sex Education Resource Center, and that's got lots of information about different programs, curricula, lesson plans, as well as things around how to advocate and lobby for more and better sex education for kids both in school as well as young adults as well. So there's lots of resources there. If you haven't checked out our website, advocatesforyouth.org, I would certainly invite you to after the webinar, of course, because you will be so engaged for the next hour, you won't be able to take your eyes off the screen. But when we're done, if you want to check out the resources, I would welcome that. So turn it over to Dan to talk a little bit about ANSWER.
Thank you, Nora. ANSWER is a small nonprofit organization based at Rutgers University, but we do national work. We've been around since 1981, and this is our 35th anniversary. Some of the services that we provide that I wanted to highlight is in-person and online trainings for adult professionals who work with youth around sexuality education. We are able to do all of our online courses in person as well. Our online courses, we currently have 7 different topic areas, including a 6-hour online workshop around LGBTQ issues. And we'll be launching 2 more additional workshops in the spring. The other program that ANSWER is well known for is our Sex Etc. program, which is both a magazine and website by teens for teens. And that magazine and website also has a great deal of content around transgender issues as well as LGBT issues. And you can find us at answer.rutgers.edu or sexetc.org. And those are the 2 websites for ANSWER's work. So today we're going to spend some time talking about how transgender issues affect us all. And we wanted to start off by just kind of bringing to the forefront of the workshop today some of the things that are happening in mainstream society. And we went in and just found some pictures to really bring home some of the points. And in that first one you see Caitlyn Jenner accepting the Glamour magazine Woman of the Year award. In the middle one, Adian Dowling was the first transgender male to be on the cover of Men's Health magazine. Laverne Cox, who is the star of the Netflix series Orange is the New Black, is seen over there on the cover of Time magazine. I Am Jazz is a TLC series around Jazz Jennings, who is a trans girl who was first featured on Our America by in a segment with Lisa Ling. And in the news, in late 2014, Mount Holyoke, which is an all-women's college, came to the forefront and said that they welcome both cisgender and transgender women to their college. So there's been a lot in the news recently around transgender issues and probably a lot of young people having a lot of questions. And so we wanted to take some time today to acknowledge that this is very much in the national spotlight right now, and to take some time to break down some of these larger concepts.
Great. So we were discussing how to condense our 3-hour in-person workshop into, as Lee said, a 55-minute webinar. We had to make some difficult choices, but we knew that starting with something as simple as just terminology and language would be really important. We do know that many of you probably, this may be a review for you, so indulge us for just a couple of minutes, because we did want to make sure that everyone by the end of this webinar is super clear on some of the distinctions between some of these terms related to gender identity and sexual orientation. So we're going to break it down kind of into 4 big chunks. I'll explain them one by one, and then I'll show you how they're related and how they're different. So Dan, if we could start with the first one, please. So this is the phrase biological sex. I'm guessing this is something that many of you are familiar with. Basically, if you think about when a baby is born and the midwife or the physician looks between the baby's legs and announces to the happy family what the biological sex is, generally that's determined on both the anatomy that you can see visually and the chromosomes that are inside. So we tend to hear those terms. Let's go to the next one. Some examples of those would be male or female, and then sometimes you'll hear the term intersex. Some people may have heard the term hermaphrodite, which is a more dated term, not one that we would recommend you use anymore. But intersex is separate from issues related to gender identity. So I'm just going to pause for a few seconds and define it, but really we will not be talking about that particular topic today because it's unrelated to issues related to gender identity. So intersex is when someone is born with some kind of difference in either how their anatomy presents itself or how their chromosomes present themselves. So it could be anatomy on the inside of their body or anatomy on the outside of their body that isn't necessarily clearly male, isn't necessarily clearly female, or maybe some combination thereof. And this is something, it's a medical condition, and what the name would be for that medical condition is intersex. So that is something that falls under the topic of biological sex. And again, not something that we'll be spending time on today, but we'd be happy to direct you to resources if it's something that you're interested in learning more about. So let's move ahead. Certainly the thing that we'll be talking about for the most part today is gender identity. And this is really someone's individual sense of what gender they are. Sometimes that aligns with what their body looks like, and sometimes it does not. So we're going to dive into when someone's gender identity and their biological sex do not align, are not the same, and we'll be introducing some terms around that. So when it comes to gender identity, let's go to the next part, give you some sample terms here. So for some, their gender identity may be male. For others, it may be female. For some, it may not be clearly one or the other, and they may choose what's more of an umbrella term called transgender. And then there are others that really don't want to define themselves in any of those ways, that don't find any of those labels or categories really fit for them, and they may choose to use the phrase genderqueer. Again, people decide for themselves what is their identity. That's not something you could give to someone, but they decide for themselves what works for them. And those are all issues related to someone's gender identity. Let's compare that now with the next one. So let's move ahead. So this is where I find a lot of people get a little bit confused. And sexual orientation, I'm guessing all of you could probably recite what the definition is, but this is really when you look outward and you look into the world and you realize what kind of people you are attracted to. This could be attraction romantically, it could be attraction sexually, and it has nothing to do with the behaviors you engage in. It more has to do with who in this world do you find sexy and what kinds of people are they. So let's move ahead and give some sample terminology here. Again, this is probably super familiar. So heterosexual, gay, lesbian, bisexual, and pansexual are all really good examples of different sexual orientations. So when I look out in the world, if I identify as a man and I find only men attractive, I would identify as gay. If I'm a woman, find women attractive, lesbian, so on and so forth. So that sexual orientation, which you can think of as outward facing. Let's do the last one. This is really gender, and there's one more little piece there to pop up in the definition. It really is very specific to the culture that you live in and how the society constructs its understanding of gender. So in the United States, gender is expressed very differently than if we were to say we were in Japan or in South Africa. Let's give some examples of what we mean by those expressions of gender. So that might be gender roles, how you express your gender identity. It might be if you are, let's say you identify as a male and you wear nail polish. That is part of your gender expression, something that may cause some to, be shocked and surprised, and others to find it no big deal. But that's related to your gender expression, which is related to but different from your sexual orientation, related to but different from your gender identity and biological sex. So hopefully by now I've made this clear as mud. So let's move forward. I'll give you a few more examples of these terminology, and then we'll give you some side by side. So again, let's bring up this definition just as a reminder, because we will be talking about this for most of today. This is really, people may identify as transgender when they find that their biological sex, so that's that sex they were assigned typically at birth, does not match when they close their eyes and connect with the gender they feel they truly are on the inside. If there's a misalignment there, those folks would tend to define themselves perhaps as transgender or genderqueer. And again, transgender is an umbrella term, so there's lots more specificity that can fall under that. But for the sake of time, we're not going to go into those details today, but just keep in mind that transgender is a really big term, an umbrella term under which many other things can fall. So let's move ahead. Just wanted to give you a visual of how this may all fall together in one human being. It's kind of odd for some people to think about that there are 4 parts of your sexuality. But if you think about it, just like anyone's face, where you would have hair on someone, you would have eyes, you would have a nose and a mouth, they look very different person to person, although the elements are all the same. Just like with our sexuality, biological sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, and gender is going to look very different on one person than, let's say, go to the next slide, than on the next person, right? Because even though we have these 4 components, how they're put together is really going to lead itself to a different outcome depending on how people define themselves. So let's just lastly, for definitions, look at 2 concepts that are often confused, and then we'll move forward. This whole idea, you've heard actually Dan and I already say LGBTQ. We put the T in with LGBTQ, but one could stop and really question whether it belongs in that category, or since it's separate from sexual orientation, which is the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and queer or questioning that you see in LGB, maybe it belongs elsewhere. So let's pull up the gender identity definition on the left. Again, this is on the internal sense of how I perceive my gender versus on the right, sexual orientation is outward facing. So inward facing for gender identity, a good example, really common, very popular, Caitlyn Jenner. Sexual orientation, another good example, this is outward facing, the gender of the people to whom I find attractive. When I look out in the world, a good example of that would be Ellen DeGeneres. So we just wanted to start with some quick definitions. I know for some it's a review, for others it's brand new information. We will keep coming back to this, so don't feel embarrassed at all if you're totally confused by this. It's really, really normal as we get started. So I'll turn it over to Dan now for the next section.
Great, thanks, Nora. For the next section, we often get asked a lot of questions around how widespread, how many transgender students are we talking about, what is happening in schools around transgender students. So we wanted to share some data that we were able to find from GLSEN's 2009 survey. And the survey was called Harsh Realities, the Experiences of Transgender Youth in Our Nation's Schools. And so to kind of set the framework here, over the next couple slides, we're going to be giving you a X number out of 10 scenario based on the results of this particular study published by GLSEN, but I wanted to set some context here. And so in 2015, in June, the New York Times had published some information around this, and looking at a couple different resources and a couple different papers, including a 2011 Williams Institute paper, the New York Times is saying that there are approximately 700,000 adults in the United States that identify as transgender. Of course, this is a really hard number to kind of solidify and put our finger on, because there may be people who identify as transgender but are not, quote unquote, out of the closet about their gender identity, so they may not identify that way to other people but only to themselves. A lot of the data that came looked at census numbers and numbers of people who changed their name either from one gender name to another gender name in the census rolls and things of that nature. But specifically for the data that we're going to look at again, this is data that was collected from youth in the United States. And I'm going to ask, as we go through, for your participation using the chat box that you see on your console for GoToWebinar. So, for example, I'm going to show you these 10 students, and we're going to take some guesses here. So, when it comes to transgender students reporting being verbally harassed at school because of their gender expression, how many out of 10 do you think report this? So you can go ahead in the chat box and take a guess, type in a number for us, and we'll see what the audience thinks. We're kind of polling the audience here. So how many out of 10 transgender students reported being verbally harassed at school because of their gender expression? So I'm going to pause for a moment and let's see what some of the numbers are that come in the chat feature.
Dan, this is Lee, and I just want to let you know that it looks like people are entering this number in the questions box, not the chat box.
Great, I can see that as well. All right,
okay,
so
good.
I see some 10s, I see some 6s, I got a 9, a 7, 2 out of 10, 5 out of 10, 7 out of 10. All right, so we are really all around the spectrum here, it looks like, in the audience. We've got some people saying 2s and 3s, some people saying 10 out of 10, some people falling more in the middle. And of course, this my guess is that a lot of those numbers that people are guessing have to do with where they're from across the country, and certainly there may be more students that are out in different parts of the country, certainly in larger cities where they may feel like there's more support services. But for this particular number here, I'm going to show you, it's actually 9 out of 10, so the number is pretty high. 9 out of 10 transgender students reported being verbally harassed at school because of their gender expression. Another important note here is that over half of this group experienced the harassment often or frequently. So this is a really high number, really important for us to kind of mull on for a little bit. And we're going to come back to really reflect on some of these numbers once we finish up the overall data. So the next number that I want to collect from people is, out of the 10 students again, how many transgender students do you think have been physically harassed in school in the past year because of their gender expression? So here's one of those terms that Nora had just introduced to us, what our gender expression is. May or may not have to do with a person's gender or gender identity, but how many students? All right, so I'm seeing high numbers again. I'm seeing, again, I've got 5s and 7s and 10s and 9 out of 10 and 8 out of 10. Got a 5 there. 6, 80%. All right, so again, this one is going to be one that, again, as with all of these, will really vary depending on where in the country students are. But from this national survey that we are looking at from GLSEN, the number that we're experiencing, the number of students that have reported are 5 out of 10. So just about 50%. Okay, so just about 50% of students that that identified as transgender and were interviewed in this survey by GLSEN said that they had been physically harassed in school during the past year because of their gender expression. So again, another really high number there. The next one is the number of students that have been physically assaulted at some point in school during the past year. So somebody has made a threat toward them. Somebody's made a threat toward their life, or threatened them with some kind of weapon or with words or whatever the case may be. So out of the 10, let's take a look now and see what we think. I got 4, 3, 6, 8, 3, 2, 3, 4, 5. Thank you all for your participation. This is wonderful. Great. Again, I'm seeing numbers all over the spectrum here, 5 to 10. Excellent. All right, so looking like maybe in general the numbers are a little bit lower on this one. People are feeling maybe this is a little bit lower. And the number is actually 4 out of 10. So a lot of people were on the right track here with lower numbers for that one. But again, 4 out of 10. 4 out of 10 transgender students have been physically assaulted at some point in school. Now, of course, we can think about the implications this has for a young person feeling safe in their school environment, being able to learn and to concentrate on their studies. It would certainly have a huge impact. Let's look at the next number. And these were the number of transgender students who were harassed or assaulted in school. Let me just see here. Sorry, I'm missing my. And did not report the incident to school staff. Okay, so these are students who experienced these things and did not tell anybody in school that it was happening. So let's get some numbers going again here. Great, I'm seeing 8s and 7s, numbers going higher again this time, 9, 10, 5, 7. Looks like we're in the upper end, between 5 and 10 for a lot of people here. Great, great. 7 out of 10, 9 out of 10. Great, great guesses, folks. Great guesses. So, in this one, again, we had about 5 out of 10. So about half of the students who were harassed or assaulted did not report the incident to their school staff. So again, that's a really high number. It makes us wonder, why are students not feeling comfortable or safe letting the people in the school who are there to really to protect them? We're in schools because we're concerned about the well-being of the young people that are there. Why are they not feeling comfortable being able to go to them and report some of these incidences that are happening? And that's really troubling. Let's look at the next set of numbers. Out of 10, how many transgender students said that school personnel most of the time are always, said that school personnel most of the time are always, when ignored it, sorry, there's a typo in there, ignored it when hearing homophobic remarks. So, let's take a guess. How many people think that the school personnel were ignoring or did not do anything when they heard homophobic remarks? 9 out of 10, 6, 8, 8, 7, 4, 3s and 4s, 8, 9, 10, 5, 8 out of 10. Lots of great numbers here. Excellent. And I saw one that said define homophobic remarks, so I'm thinking these are, in the survey they probably outlined these specifically. To my best of my recollection, it was things like fag, homo, tranny, things along those natures, along those lines. Okay, test on my comments appearing. I'm seeing we have a lot of people. Somebody's asking if their comments are appearing. We have a lot of people who are in the question box, so they're kind of flying by really fast here. So unfortunately, if we're not responding to your comments, it's just because they're flying by really fast to us. So I apologize for that. I'm just trying to catch the numbers here as they're going through. I see 70%. All right, let's take a look at the number in this one here. So 2 out of 10 transgender students said that school personnel most of the time did not do anything or ignored it when they heard homophobic remarks happening in the school. So that's a lower number, but unfortunately still a disturbing number, because really, when we think back to that question of why students are not reporting information to teachers and other administrators in school, it might be because they have had experiences where teachers or other personnel may have ignored a homophobic experience. All right, one last one here that I'd like to get people's opinions on. Out of 10, how many transgender students reporting missing at least one day of school during the past month because they felt unsafe or uncomfortable? 6, 5, 2, 8, 3, 6, 7, 6 out of 10. Lots of numbers coming in here. Again, we're all over the spectrum. 7 out of 10, 8, 60%, 30%, 9, 4s, all of them, so 10 out of 10. Great, great. Thank you again for your participation, folks. 40% I'm seeing. 5 out of 10. So that means of all transgender students that were surveyed in here, about 50% of them reported missing at least one day of school during the past month because they felt unsafe or uncomfortable in school, whether it was because they're being verbally harassed, physically harassed, assaulted, maybe because they feel like the school administrators or teachers are not supportive, or they're not feeling safe. Those are some of the big topics that I think would probably contribute to students missing school because they're not feeling safe or they're feeling uncomfortable. Again, this data is coming from the GLSEN 2009 Harsh Reality Survey, and you'll have this information in the webinar, the slides that ASHA will be sending out post-webinar. We just kind of wanted to get some feedback from you guys, what you think about this. So what does this tell us about the likely experiences of the youth that we're seeing in school? If you want to go ahead and type some responses, and if you can give us a one-word answer here, what one word would you use to describe how you would think transgender students' experiences have been in school? Silent suffering. Improving, it's tough, ignorance, unwanted, unprotected, lonely, safe, confusing, negative, fearful, scary, hard, disturbing, ignored. Improving, sad, excluded, lonely, frustrated, marginalized, suicidal, depressing, depends heavily, okay, heavily on the area. Yeah, these are all right on point, folks. Definitely young people who are feeling sad, they're feeling isolated, they don't know who to talk to, they're missing school because of it. It could be affecting certainly graduation rates of some of these young people, certainly could be increasing their likelihood of suicide. I saw one of the numbers, one of the words in there. Certainly could be increasing likelihood of substance use or tobacco, alcohol use, of those things. And so we know that the transgender community, certainly transgender youth, are reported to be at higher risk for a lot of these things. And so that's certainly something that we want to keep in mind as well. What are some things that we think schools can do to make the environment more welcoming for transgender students? Does anybody have any thoughts on that? We'd love to hear real quick in the question box. More resources? Absolutely. Safe zones, yes. We have definitely had research done that shows safe zones and GSAs in schools certainly increase the likelihood of students being comfortable in school and coming to school. Transgender restrooms, stop lining up boys and girls, absolutely. Inclusive curricula, stronger policies, educating teachers, being inclusive. Absolutely, these are all great answers. Normalize diversity, denormalizing gender binaries, teachers standing up for students. These are all really, really great. So you can see why this is really important and why this topic is really important and quite frankly very timely, and why ASHA was wanting to provide this information and these resources today. So thank you all for your participation in that segment. I'm actually going to hand it back over to Nora at this point, and we're going to keep moving forward.
Responses, were there any tips that she provided that were surprising, maybe you hadn't thought of before? Any good reminders about stuff that you're already doing or you see your colleagues doing in schools? Just put a couple of thoughts in the question box if you want to, if you have reactions or responses to that little clip with some recommendations from Jazz Jennings. Great, so we have some folks maybe appreciating that we're using some more mainstream youth-focused information about transgender issues. Right on, I totally agree. It's great to have young people talking to young people, so the more you can use those images and those clips in your teaching, in your education, I find it super effective. So thanks for that feedback about that. Great. Also looking like there's some questions about if we wanted to talk about these issues or if we wanted to use a clip like this, would we need to have Sex Ed Advisory Board approval? You know, state laws are very, very different right down to the district level, but I often encourage folks, when in doubt, get approval. If that's even just checking in with your supervisor or the building principal or whoever your boss is, to make sure if you were to talk about this issue or you were to use a clip like this, that there wouldn't be any backlash, you would be covered, it would be in alignment with what your school's curriculum might be, for example, if you work for a school. So I always would recommend that. Let's see some other ones. Great, yes, we need to get that in front of students. I totally agree. Yep. Someone's saying it's really not that hard. We make things more complicated. It's so true. I think that sometimes we as adults overthink things when really when you hear it from a young person, it's pretty straightforward. I totally agree with you that I think we sometimes put more into this than it needs to be. It's really good. Yes, lots of good positive responses here about being respectful, how important this is, not assuming, just listening. So thank you for that feedback. I think you see as clearly as Dan and I did about the importance of honoring whatever someone's identity is and asking and not making assumptions. So we hope that that's a clip that may be useful for you. There's lots of other great information from that show, so I'd recommend if you haven't checked it out to definitely make a point of doing that. So let me turn it back over to Dan at this point.
All right. So just keeping in mind that this is a 55-minute webinar, essentially, that we've really kind of taken from a 3-hour pre-conference session, we did want to make sure that we included some applications here so that in addition to getting some information out there, we wanted to make sure people felt like we could talk about some of those pieces that make this applicable in a school setting or environment. So we're just going to quickly go through a couple scenarios and again use the chat feature in your console there to talk about some different scenarios in school. So we're going to present to you, and then we're just going to hear from the group what are some thoughts they have about the different scenarios we're presenting. So in the first scenario, you're a health or PE teacher in a middle school. You're told that there's a transgender student who is requesting to change in the locker room of the gender they identify as versus the biological sex they were assigned at birth. You know the school nurse has a single-stall bathroom, but it's on the other side of the school from the gym. What could you do to ensure that this student is able to change in a space that they feel comfortable without impacting their ability to participate in class? So I'd love to hear if anybody has had this experience and how their schools are handling it, any policies that exist around the country that people are implementing this, and just some thoughts that people have. Let them change in your PE office. That's a great, great idea. What are some other things? Use an empty classroom. Allow 5-minute late window. Okay, great. Allow them to use what they're most comfortable. Let the student change in the nurse's office or bathroom. Ask the student where they would like to change. I see a lot of ask the student what they want. Not allowing the student could affect Title IX. Meet the students, but include the parents. Meet the student needs and include the parents in the conversation. Great. Meet the needs of the students. Let them use the faculty bathroom. Give the person the opportunity to leave if needed, to go to the restroom they needed. These are all really great. These are all really great suggestions. Yes, absolutely. Perhaps the students could change, have a private spot to change. Perhaps they could change before reporting to class. Perhaps you could talk with that student to brainstorm other locations where they might be able to change. Yeah, there's a lot of different options coming in, and I'd say that it sounds like people are really understanding that we really want to create an environment that's inclusive and feels comfortable for students. And so just so that people don't feel like they're on their own, there are schools all across the country that are really trying to figure these topics out, the bathrooms, the locker rooms, but recognizing that that's not all there is to transgender issues. And that's a really important takeaway message that I want people to hear today, is that it's not just about restrooms and locker rooms, but there's a lot of issues, and that's why we wanted to introduce some of that data that we introduced earlier, just to show what a huge impact this has on the school setting and the school environment for young people. Because if they're not feeling safe, if they're not having their needs met, if they're not being supported, they are less likely to come to school. They are less likely to feel safe in school. If they don't feel safe, they're not going to be able to learn even if they're there. So there's a lot of issues to consider around transgender issues beyond the bathroom and the locker room. So let's look at another scenario here that'll take us outside of bathrooms and locker rooms here. So you're a new health or PE teacher. teaching mostly ninth grade. You're told by the school counselor that an incoming ninth grader is transgender and in the early stages of transitioning from the biological sex they were born to the gender they truly are. This is the first time you've had a transgender student in your class, and you are already keenly aware of the upcoming reproductive system lesson. What steps could you take to ensure that your classes are inclusive of your students who are transgender without overly complicating the information for the rest of your students? So here it's, I see using gender-neutral terms. Here's some curricula questions here, so taking it into the classroom. So great, using gender-neutral terms is certainly one. What are some other things that we can do? When we're talking about the reproductive anatomy, okay? Not talk about the male anatomy or the female anatomy. Okay, so we got reproductive anatomy coming up. What might we use instead of male and female? What are some terms? Allow for questions and answers, cover all aspects of sexuality, include discussions on intersex individuals, okay? Recognizing that intersex is not the same as transgender, so we just want to make sure we're bringing that point home. Bodies with a uterus, great, I love that. Reproductive systems in general. Use the biological appropriate terms, use gender-neutral terms. Cover different terms, explain how orientation, identity, and biological sex are different for each person. Great. Intersex is not transgender, but discussing normalized health queerness that I think is helpful. Great. The reproductive system does change depending on the audience. Use body parts names, not male and female. Excellent. Make sure students know that all sexuality topics, reproduction, and all is a check the fit topic. Everyone has different feelings of values and beliefs, okay? Spoke with someone more experienced to make sure I wouldn't make awful mistakes. And that's such a great point. So definitely, it's okay to ask for help for these things. There's lots of resources, and in our next section, we are going to be talking about some of the resources that are out there and that are available to people, certainly when they're talking about these topics in the classroom. We certainly would want to make sure, you know, I know that as teachers, we all go in with the best of intentions, and I think it's very, very okay and also very appreciated when we're transparent about that. When we tell students, I'm not an expert necessarily on all of these different types of topics. I'm not perfect. I'm a human, and I may make mistakes. And I'd encourage you to, you know, point it out to me if I'm making a mistake or if I'm saying something that feels hurtful or in any way. And really be transparent about that, because I think that students would certainly respect that and appreciate that. Have inclusive resources, posters hanging in the classroom. Yeah, that's great as well. These are all really great ideas. Yeah, so really what we wanted to bring home here is that, again, there's lots of ways in the classroom. Certainly we're seeing transgender issues being very popular in mainstream society, but we're starting to talk about them more in school, and that's really exciting and certainly necessary. But we wanted to make sure that we're not just talking about locker rooms and bathrooms. We want to make sure that there are issues much greater here. There's issues around personal safety. There are issues around dropout rates. There's issues around substance abuse. There's issues around emotional and mental health that are all connected to a transgender young person's experience in schools. And this is why it's really important that we're having this conversation, and really important that we are brainstorming ideas and working together to really look at what's out there already. And just so people know, there are model policies that exist out there. It just takes doing a little bit of research to find out what some of those model policies are. There are model curricula. There's different resources available. And with that, I'm actually going to hand it back over to Nora to talk about what some of those resources are.
Terrific. Thanks, Dan. It's just so encouraging to see so many of you having such great ideas. I can tell that there's a wealth of experience and expertise in our group today, which is really terrific. Also just wanted to reinforce something that Dan was just mentioning and a couple of folks commented on. It's always a great idea to actually just talk with that young person directly. I find sometimes I get intimidated. I'm supposed to be the expert in the room. I'm supposed to know everything about everything because I'm the teacher. But as Dan just mentioned, I think it's always really powerful to stop and just say, hey, I could use some more training on this to my supervisor, or hey, I'm not sure I'm using the right terminology. Can someone help me with this? Or even approaching that young person and saying, what would make you most comfortable? What is a pronoun that you're comfortable with? How can I do my best to, make this classroom a safe, productive learning environment for you? So I would never be ashamed or embarrassed to get support and training. I know myself, I've done that many times on this issue. I'm still learning as well. And I think that that's the only way that we can all grow and stretch as we continue to do this work, because it does seem to change all the time. So in that light, we did want to just end with giving you some resources. There are 3 in particular of many, many, many that are out there. So we are only highlighting 3, but just know that there's a ton out there that are just wonderful. The 3 we just wanted to spotlight. One is that model policy that Dan was just mentioning. It comes from GLSEN. So that's the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network. They do some amazing work on this topic. And this particular model district policy on transgender and gender nonconforming students that you see on the left-hand side of your screen is available on their website for free to download. It's got some really terrific sample language to use. It will also be included in the post-webinar email that goes out with a copy of these slides. We've given you the direct link to access that particular document from GLSEN, so you don't have to go hunting around for it. But if you are looking at the district level or the state level, or just even want to educate yourself on policy issues, I would highly recommend getting your hands on this document and reading it. I find it very helpful, and so it's one to make sure that you're aware of. And then on the right-hand side is the GLAD Media Reference Guide, and this is really just something to keep handy around terminology. I was seeing in some of the questions that you asked kind of earlier in the webinar about some of those definitions and some of those terms. There are terms that some people use in some parts of the country, but not in other parts of the country. There are some terms that become dated as new terms become more preferable or more empowering. So I know it can be challenging to keep up with what the language is that best reflects people's identities and how to best honor them. But this resource from GLAD is a really great handy reference that's got a lot of definitions, a lot of good explanations about what different terms mean. So whenever I get a question about a term I've never heard of, which always happens, this is one of the places that I go to. So lastly, we want to share with you a brand new resource. So Dan, let's go to the next slide. This is a really tremendous resource. I'm actually looking at my copy here on my desk as we're doing this webinar. It's called the Teaching Transgender Toolkit. It comes from, in my opinion, 2 of the best educator trainers on this topic, Dr. Eli Green and Luca Maurer. They work together to put together this particular toolkit that's got all kinds of information for both us as professionals, to how to increase our understanding and our capacity to teach and train about these issues. It's got great exercises to do both with colleagues if you're leading a workshop or a professional development seminar, as well as with young people, both in school settings and community-based settings. I found I was just reading it cover to cover, from some of the language that they use to just some of the thoughtfulness, and even something as simple as like an icebreaker activity. They were really thoughtful about some of the language that they used about transgender people and issues to make it very gentle and welcoming and easily accessible by folks who maybe not, familiar with any of this stuff. So I would highly recommend it. You can go to teachingtransgender.org. Again, that website will be in your follow-up slides to find out more information. The toolkit is for sale. I think it's a relatively nominal fee. I think maybe $40 or $50. I don't remember exactly, but not too expensive, which is great. But even if you decide not to buy it, which is fine, there's lots of great information, as you can see from their website. So there's lots of good information just listed on their blog and their tips. So I know I'm going on and on about this, but it's brand new, and from my opinion, it's one of the best in the field. So I'd highly recommend, if this is a topic you're interested in, or if you want to get some more information or share it with your colleagues, this would be a good place to start. So I think we will stop there, just acknowledging that there are more resources than Dan and I could be familiar with. Let me just ask for folks to put into the answer question box if there are other resources that you've encountered, or maybe that you've created or have seen before, that you would recommend, because we are certainly always looking for other ones to add to our toolkit and to be aware of. So please go ahead and type into the answer, the question box, if there are any other resources you would recommend our colleagues know about or become familiar with, so that we can all help educate each other. I'm not quite as good as Dan was keeping up with the chat box, but here I'll try. So someone recommended the Trevor Project. Absolutely, that's a great suggestion. It's a really great website and resource. People often know it for the hotline, suicide prevention hotline, which is really an important resource all young people know about, but they've got great additional resources as well. Teaching Tolerance, yep, that's a really wonderful one. It's about diversity education in lots of facets, one of them being gender identity and sexual orientation. They've got a great website and a magazine for educators. I've often found some really great stuff there. It Gets Better is another one. It looks like there's a respect program from the American Psychological Association, which is great. Some folks are listing some specific state resources, one from Vermont, one from Massachusetts. So I know I see Lori listing some great stuff from Michigan. So I know a lot of our colleagues have done a lot of great thinking about this. And let me just highlight one more. It's getsmetrosexual.org, or I think it's metrosexual.org or something like that. Tracy's got it listed there. And that's the one with the gender-bred person, if people have seen that model. It's one Dan and I debated about whether we had time to introduce in this particular webinar, and it just didn't quite make the cut. But it's a great one. It's one that students find really accessible and easy to understand. So if you've not seen it before, you can go to that website or just Google gender-bred person, and you'll see that image will pop up. So knowing that we just have just about 5 minutes left, why don't we go ahead and Dan and I will post our email addresses and all the contact information for our organizations if you're on Twitter, or if you're on Tumblr, or if you're on Facebook, or just want to email us the old-fashioned way. We would be happy to chat with you more one-on-one and answer questions directly. I will turn it over to Lee at this point. We do look like we have just about 5 or so minutes, so we might be able to get 1 or 2 questions, but I'll turn it back over to Lee to facilitate these last few minutes for us.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Dan and Nora, for a great session. We have a ton of questions that came in from the beginning of the session, so if we can kind of get back to that point. Let's see. One person asked, what is the curriculum that you suggest using for staff and students?
Dan, is it okay if I jump in here?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I'm going to do a little self-promotion, which I normally don't do, but I'm... So Advocates for Youth is just a couple days away from releasing our brand new K-12 sexuality education curriculum that is called Rights, Respect, Responsibility. It is free. I want to emphasize that, free. And it is a curriculum that is fully inclusive, kindergarten through 12th grade. We start talking about gender identity in elementary and middle school, and continue in complexity up through high school. So I would recommend some of the resources that by Friday, if you come back to our advocatesforyouth.org website, you'll find there. There's a teacher's guide that has a whole section on gender identity, which I think would be really helpful for folks that are novice to read. In addition, there are over 80 lesson plans that you can download for free and see if any of those might supplement some of the current curriculum that you utilize or expand on the current work that you do. I just speak of that one because I was just editing all those lesson plans and it's fresh in my mind. But Dan, do you have others that you want to suggest?
That would have been the one that I would have pointed to as well. If people are looking for professional development for adults, I'll reinforce that we have the online workshop. It's called LGBTQ Issues in Schools, and it's not specific to gender identity. It does include sexual orientation, but there is one whole unit in that workshop, and that's available with more information at answer.rutgers.edu.
Great, thank you. And I would also just do a little bit of promotion for ASHA with regards to that advocates curriculum, because we have invited Nora to come back and present a webinar on February 17th at 3 o'clock Eastern Time. So we'll be promoting that, and if you are interested in learning more about that, please save the date for that. The next question is, what's the difference between physical harassment and physical assault?
Dan, do you want to take that one?
Sure. So physical harassment may be things like pushing, shoving, and then physical harassment takes it to the next level where there may be a weapon. Physical assault takes it to the next level where there may be a weapon involved. There may be a threat to somebody's life. It's just kind of, I guess, to the levels of extreme is really kind of the best way. They do in the survey, in the harsh reality survey, define exactly what they mean by each, but unfortunately I don't have the full survey in front of me at the moment. So if you're wondering just how they clarified the difference between the two in the survey that is available through, again, that's the 2009 Harsh Reality Survey available by Glisten.
Okay, great. Thank you. Here's a question that's, how do we respond to members in our community who claim that gender identity is an ideology and that it teaches that a gender, gender, I'm having a hard time with this question, is a non-binary approach to gender? Sorry if I messed that up.
Yeah, no, that's a good question.
Okay.
Yep. I will start, and Dan, please jump in. I think this is really tricky because oftentimes, just like we hear around sexual orientation, people believe that sexual orientation is a choice when we know that's just not what the science shows us, and same around gender identity. Gender identity and recognizing that there are people for whom the binary does not reflect who they are is just a matter of fact. It's not an opinion, it's not an ideology, it's not a faith perspective, it just is. And from my perspective, I don't indulge anyone who believes otherwise, and whether it's showing them research or whether it's having statements from all the major scientific organizations or the adolescent health organizations, I just really try not to engage in that dialogue because it's just not one that's very productive. So I don't know, Dan, would you take a different approach? I'm a little hardcore about that.
No, I'm in line with you. Some of the things that I'd say in reference to maybe school environments is it might be, and I know money is often tight, but actually having a guest speaker come in for parents in the evening might be a way to kind of address some of the concerns the community may have, especially if that's something that is addressed in your curricula. If your state has guidelines and laws around what specifically needs to be taught around gender identity, certainly having those posted or having a resource available for parents to show specifically what the guidelines are that are required, and that kind of helps create a little bit of a safety zone for you as well, when you get those tough questions from parents.
Okay, thank you so much, Nora and Dan. We have reached the end of the hour. I want to remind everybody that we have a slide up right now, just for another minute or so, that includes ways in which you can contact both Nora and Dan if you have any additional questions. And I also want to remind you that we'll be sending an email out later this week that will include a link to the recording of today's session so that you can share it with others. And we'll also include some resources in there. I took a note that someone had asked for some websites, and we'll share the slides and then whatever else Dan and Nora think would be useful to share with you. So look for that later this week. Thank you so much, and have a good day. Bye-bye.